Hello, welcome to our introduction to the Hebrew Bible, to session 17. As we move into the book of Numbers, I am shocked that only four other screens, but five other people wanted to dig deeply into the book of Numbers. But hopefully we will demonstrate to all of them how it is their loss, because actually the book of Numbers is a pretty sweet book in the Bible. As we'll discover. So I'm going to turn on the screen share now. There we go. And we will go ahead and begin. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Come, let us bow down and bend the knee and kneel before the Lord our Maker, for he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture and the sheep of his hand. Oh, that today you would hearken to his voice. Harden not your hearts as your forebears did in the wilderness at Meribah and on that day at Massa when they tempted me. They put me to the test, though they had seen my works. 40 years long I detested that generation and said, this people are wayward in their hearts. They do not know my ways. So I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter into my rest. This is, of course, from the Venite, that is said in morning prayer on a regular basis. This is the longer version of the Venite, because it's generally a song of praise. You do the longer version during Lent when you want to feel really crappy about yourself. So that's why I thought that'd be appropriate. Because, of course, this psalm draws upon the reality of the failures of the people during the wilderness wandering. So, my goodness, I've got to update this. It says for Exodus. That's inaccurate. For Leviticus. No, we're not. We've done for Numbers. 3 texts. I'm paying attention. Bible, how to read the Bible. This is the interpretation commentary on Numbers. Dennis Olson. I am going to be using next week another book, To Kill and Take Possession, which explores violence and warfare. When we get a little more deeply into the conquest narrative. But in the early part of Numbers, Olson's commentary is very, very good. And so we'll be drawing from that on our discussion tonight. Just a little review. Make sure you're paying attention. Everything you get right, you get a Tootsie Roll. You have to buy it yourself, though, and submit a receipt to the church for reimbursement. So that's not that exciting. So if you all remember 2 types of law found in the Pentateuch, casuistic or case law, how would that be defined if your name's not Nancy Collins? Because she's like a former lawyer, and so surely she knows the answer to that. So like it'd be unfair to let her answer.
Is that about consequences for like a casuistic? Seems like it has cause in it.
Yes.
So
ding, 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 ding. Conditional statement and type of punishment to be meted out. So if you do this, then this is so if you beat someone up, then you give him a bowl of chili. You know, whatever seems to be the punishment that meets the crime. Lovely. And then there's apodictic law. Very different. What's apodictic law? I'm God and I said no. Basically, right? This is like, there's no, like, it's not like, don't murder people or we'll murder you. But it's just like, don't murder people because I'm God and I said no. So apodictic law are regulations that are in the form of divine commands. The 10 Commandments, of course, being the best example of apodictic law. And then what is the sort of law code that's found in Leviticus? Do you remember there's 4 different law codes found in the Pentateuch, and a specific law code is the one we get in Leviticus. Does anyone remember what it is?
One is liturgical.
Right, ritual, right?
Priestly.
There it is. Good job, Michelle. The priestly code, which is in various parts of Exodus, but is all of Leviticus and also most of Numbers. It includes the holiness code in Leviticus 17 to 26, emphasizes ceremonial, institutional, and ritualistic practices, and is a revision of these pre-exilic sources that are reinterpreted by the experiences of the Babylonian exile. So the priestly code is what Leviticus, of course, which would make sense, right? Because Leviticus is for the Levitical priesthood. Good. Lovely. Oh, look, there's another review question.
Oh.
Oh, I revealed the answer too quick. Alex Trebek died, and I failed in doing a good Trebek. We love Trebek. How do we read and understand a ritual and holy in the Hebrew scriptures? While they're not our rituals, we don't just get rid of ritual text. We know there's meaning there. So how do we find them? Oh, I didn't actually get rid of the answer. How do you, when you're reading as a 21st century Christian, how do you find the meaning in a ritual text? Look at the meaning that the ritual conveys. So what is the ritual actually doing? What is it telling us about God and about the world? That's how you figure that out. And the example we talked about last week was, for example, Leviticus 9, one of the examples, Aaron's priesthood inaugurated, that it happened on the 8th day, the beginning of the world after creation. They entered the tent of meeting for the first time. They blessed the people a second time. The ritual is converted into reality as God actually appears. And what did we learn from all of that? So the ritual is clearly not important for us because I am not sacrificing animals anytime soon, because Nancy Collins would leave the church. So clearly I can't do that. I like her too much. Right?
And everybody else, too.
If I started animal sacrifice, you're right, Nancy, it would be more than just you that'd probably leave the church. So we're not going to do the ritual text, but when we look at the reality envisioned by the text, we see that the priests, given stewardship over the holy, must extend that holiness over the world. That's how you look at what is the ritual meaning the text conveys, and how do we understand that? Because that becomes what's meaningful for us as modern interpreters of these scriptures. Questions on that? Just a brief little overview of what we did last week. Great.
Okay.
So let's talk about the book of Numbers, which you might think, so this is an entire book about a census? Oh my goodness, and I thought Leviticus was dry. Not quite. It's not just an entire book about numbers. The Hebrew title of this book is actually In the Wilderness. And I really wish that when they had written the Latin title, which we get our English title from, they would have stuck with that, because I think people would have been more likely to read the book of Numbers if it was called In the Wilderness as opposed to Numbers. This is the story of the Israelite journey in the desert as they go from Mount Sinai and the plains of Moab, and it also includes some supplemental covenant laws. And so you can see the journey there in the picture I've got for you out there about that journey of what that route of the Exodus looked like with the wilderness wanderings. It covers the 40-year period in which the original generation who left Egypt all die. As we'll find out in the book of Numbers, that the original generation gets to the promised land, they're ready to enter, and they say, this is never going to work. And then God says, okay, you all don't get to come in. So he sends them back to wander for 40 years, and then it's a different generation that enters. The book of Numbers is also a preparation for military conquest. It's emphasizing God's loyalty despite Israel's failings, and the conquest of the settlement of the land, which is east of the Jordan River. Because what happened, if you look at my little chart here, is they come up, and they were going to approach the Holy Land from the south. But that was when they failed and freaked out. And so they wound up going backwards, wandering for 40 years. And then they come up along the east end and enter the promised land, actually by crossing the River Jordan, which becomes important for us as Christians in the New Testament, because when John the Baptist reinaugurates the people of Israel, he calls them to come out to the desert, to the River Jordan, to be baptized, because that is the place where the people actually enter the promised land. You would assume, coming from Egypt, they would enter from the south, but they didn't. They entered from the Dead Sea, from the River Jordan, and that's why John the Baptist was out there baptizing. I've made that point in sermons before. It's been very powerful. People just can't help themselves by being fascinated with my knowledge of biblical studies. None of this is true. And Catherine's laughing at me. I love this. But it's also a difficult book to read. I want to be honest about that. Numbers is weird. It's a tremendous mixture of genres. There's narrative, there's additional laws, there's census lists, there's oracles from a pagan prophet. Ooh, oh boy. There's the Aaronic blessing that may the Lord, face to shine upon you all. But how does it all fit together? All these varied genres that are pushed together into the book of Numbers. So let's talk about that. Content and structure. So the Exodus generation, as I mentioned, refused to enter at the southern route of Kadesh. And so God refused to let them enter the promised land at all. So the Numbers is the story of their wandering. You can see point 12 on the map I've got there, Kadesh Barnea, is where they entered, and then they go, and then they start going backwards. So that's where that happened in point 12. There are 4 key narratives in the book of Numbers that I'm going to have us look at. Some of them this week and some of them next week. First is preparation for the journey. There's an exploration of Moses's and Aaron's leadership. There's the Balaam cycle, in which I would say also includes the seduction at Shittim with Baal of Peor. And then there's the actual preparation for the conquest that occurs towards the end of the book of Numbers. Those are kind of the 4 key parts of the book that I want to be sure we look at as we go through our kind of survey of Old Testament. Interspersed in this, though, are census tracts, genealogies, laws from the Levitical code. Like I said, lots of other stuff mixed together in this book. This is not a book that is one specific genre. I'll say that all again, apparently. Okay. So how then would you read Numbers? Remember, of course, the key points we've learned about reading these texts. Number 1, the primary and driving force in Scripture, particularly in the Pentateuch, is God's promise and covenant with Abraham that his descendants would inherit Canaan, what we know as the Promised Land. This is fundamental to everything we've read so far in the Pentateuch, and it is fundamental to the book of Numbers as well. Also important, the conquest of the Promised Land is really the second stage. The second stage of a holy war that began with Exodus. First, God was the divine warrior in Exodus, bringing the people out and conquering the Egyptians, but now the people of Israel will be the divine warriors. This is the reason for the census lists, why they're getting track of how many people of certain age in every tribe, because they want to know what sort of a army do we have to enter into this warfare. So the promise of the land, and then the received conquest of the land, which we get in Numbers. This is fun. The driving theme that we get throughout this book. Also remember, the wilderness is always where God forms God's people. This is true now in our own time. This was true in the time of Numbers. This was true in the time of the exile, when the people were in a wilderness exile experience. This was true with John the Baptist. This is true with Jesus in the 40 days in the desert. Over and over and over again, the wilderness is the crucible wherein God forms God's people to be who God's calling them to be. So that's another just really key point in all of this. A couple other key points. Remember, after the promise of the land, Abraham did what? He built an altar. So Numbers is concerned both with the presence of God, but also with the proper worship of God. The idea that the covenant of God with Abraham to the promised land could be separated from right worship of God doesn't make any sense to the author of Numbers. So those two things remain very interrelated. Also, the people continue in Numbers to be disobedient and complaining. You get all of these grumbling narratives. They complain against God. They complain against Moses. But over and over again, God responds to them with compassion and mercy. So the emphasis in all of this is on God's great compassion for sinful people, that God will indeed ensure the promise is made real despite the sin of the people. So in summary, Numbers is God's story of keeping God's covenant, no matter the sins of the people of Israel. And that's what we really get as we move through the book of Numbers. Questions, comments?
Father Jared,
Yeah.
on your map,
Yeah.
Is that all Numbers, or is part of that Exodus?
Part of that is Exodus. So Numbers really begins with the failure at close to the failure at Kadesh Barnea. This is a map of the actual Exodus route.
Okay.
Good question. Other questions, comments? All right. So let's go ahead and push forward and see what we can learn. So in terms of structure, I gave you kind of the 4 key narratives that I'm going to engage in this course. But when we think of structure numbers, it's actually pretty hard to give a structure to numbers because of the significant drawing together of various texts. But there is a sort of structure that I think is discernible. The book of Numbers can be divided into basically 2 halves. Verses 1 through 25 are the old generation of rebellion. This is the generation that left Egypt, but did not have faith to enter the promised land. So you get in chapters 1 through 3 a census of the tribes and of the Levites. You get in chapters 4 through 10 various sections of law and ritual. Verses 11 to 21, the narrative of the spies, and then the rebellion, the refusal to enter the land. Chapter 22 through 24, the Balak and Balaam cycle, which is so important. And then chapter 25, the final rebellion of the people, which culminates in God's decision for the end of that old generation that they will not enter the promised land. The second half of Numbers is chapters 26 through 36. This is the new generation of hope, which begins just like the first half began with a second census. So the first generation has died. Who do we have now to enter the promised land? Again, there's a section of laws and ritual being restated, not as long as in the first section, but still there. Then there's a war against the Midianites in chapter 31, which is really drawing back upon chapter 35, where there had been a failure that had occurred, which we'll get into a little bit later here. Chapter 32 through 33, the spy story and the journey, that should be journey, is typo there, journey remembered. So looking back on the journey that they've been through of the spies, all of that failure that occurred. And then chapters 34, that should say through 36, man, I was the king of typos putting these slides together. You get laws for what the new land will look like now that the people have entered it. There's division of the land, there's refuge cities, all of that. It's kind of a 2-part book, I would say, with the larger part of the book being the first half and the shorter part of the book being the second half. But you can see there's a little bit of similarity between the 2 sections. Questions, thoughts, comments? So let's go ahead and read some of the book of Numbers, which I'm sure is what you've all stayed up this late for. So if you got a Bible handy, turn to the book of Numbers, chapter 1. And I'll bring it up on my own screen here. We're going to do verses 1 through 21. The Lord spoke, and that's the Lord Yahweh. Yahweh spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tent of meeting on the first day of the 2nd month, in the 2nd year after they had come out of the land of Egypt, saying, take a census of the whole congregation of Israelites in their clans by their ancestral houses according to the number of names, every male individually, from 20 years old and upwards, everyone in Israel able to go to war. Apparently, the rule about going to war in Numbers was much higher of a threshold than it is in the US of A. Awkwardly enough. You and Aaron shall enroll them company by company. A man from each tribe shall be with you, each man the head of his ancestral house. These are the names of the men who shall assist you. From Reuben, Elazar, son of Shedeur. From Simeon, Shelumiel, son of Zerishadai. From Judah, Nahshon, son of Amminadab. From Issachar, Nathaniel, son of Zuar. From Zebulun, Eliab, son of Helon. From the sons of Joseph, from Ephraim, Elishama, son of Ammihud. From Manasseh, Gamaliel, son of Pedazar. Yeah, these are the verses you never want a sign to read during scripture. It's not unsurprising. Numbers does not show up in the lectionary that often. From Benjamin, Abidan, son of Gideoni. From Dan, Ahiezer, son of Ammishaddai. From Asher, Pagiel, son of Okran. From Gad, Eliasaph, son of Deuel. From Naphtali, Ahira, son of Enan. Sure. These were the ones chosen from the congregation, the leaders of their ancestral tribes, the heads of the divisions of Israel. Moses and Aaron took these men who had been designated by name, and on the first day of the second month, they assembled the whole congregation together. They registered themselves in their clans by their ancestral houses, according to the number of names from 20 years old and upwards individually, as the Lord had commanded Moses. So he enrolled them in the wilderness of Sinai. The descendants of Reuben, Israel's firstborn in their lineage, in their clans, by their ancestral houses, according to the number of names individually, every male from 20 years old and upwards, everyone able to go to war. Those enrolled in the tribe of Reuben were 46,500. I'm going to stop right there. I'm not reading the rest of this because it's the list. It's all the numbers. But I want this numbers is about numbers. It's about the census list. And so you have to start where the actual book begins. Note, of course, that the census is for those 20 years old and upwards. Everyone in Israel able to go to war. These are former slaves now being transformed into an army as we get the list of how many soldiers we're going to have. Order, leadership, assignment of duties, calculation of resources, organization of the community. All of these things, as we'll see in the book of Numbers, are part of how do you transform a community of slaves into an army that can conquer one of the most important territorial pieces of land in the ancient Near East. The census at the end, as you get to the end of the first part of Numbers, finds 603,550 men of age to fight in the battle, which would be a significant host, a significant army. That should give courage as they're approaching the promised land. You've got over 500,000 people ready to do battle of age and ready to do that. So this is a great kind of, we'll move forward. We can do this sort of moment, or at least it should be. We'll find out how that doesn't actually play out that way, though. But then at the same time, there's an exclusion that occurs of the Levites that I want to acknowledge, and this will pick up in verse 47 now. The Levites, however, were not numbered by their ancestral tribe along with them. The Lord said to Moses, only the tribe of Levi you shall not enroll, you shall not take a census of them with the other Israelites. Rather, you shall appoint the Levites over the tabernacle of the covenant and over all of its equipment and over all that belongs to it. They are to carry the tabernacle and all its equipment, and they shall tend it, and they shall camp around the tabernacle. When the tabernacle is set out, the Levites shall take it down, and when the tabernacle is to be picked, the Levites shall set it up. And any outsider who comes near shall be put to death. The other Israelites shall camp in their respective regimental camps by companies, but the Levites shall camp around the tabernacle of the covenant, so that there may be no wrath on the congregation of the Israelites, and the Levites shall perform the guard duty of the tabernacle of the covenant. And the Israelites did so. They did just as the Lord had commanded Moses. So the Levites, remember, are a priestly tribe. These are the sons of Levi, Aaron, of course, being a Levite. They are exempted from military service. Their job is to care for the tabernacle, set it up, take it down, but also to camp around the tabernacle. That they are the guards to ensure that should they be invaded by another nation, the tabernacle will be kept secure. They have several tasks, as I've said: carry equipment, erect or dismantle the tabernacle, camp around the tabernacle to protect it from possible invaders, but also to protect from the rest of the people, to ensure that the average Joe's not wandering willy-nilly into the tabernacle. Makes sense? Questions, thoughts?
Only that there's no women mentioned. You got to wonder if there's that many men, how many women and children are tagging along?
Yeah, so generally you would take the number of men and multiply it by 3, is what most scholars would do. So if there's 600,000, then, you'd say there's probably at least 2 to 3 million people at this time. And there's some significant debate at this point. Are these numbers accurate? How could it be that 12 kids who go to Egypt wind up becoming several million people by the end of the Egyptian slave? And there are scholars on one side who are very happy to demonstrate that that's totally doable. There are scholars on the other side that would say this is a ridiculous number. There's no reality to it. And actually, they argue that when it says there's, for example, 600,000, that word thousand could also be translated as household. So it's saying there's 600 households. So there's some debate about whether or not these numbers are translated accurately, because it is a lot of people, 3 million people wandering through the desert, right? Yeah.
Well, and how do you support them all? You're in a desert.
Yeah, you wonder why they grumble about lack of food and water. Well, 3 million people camping in the desert, probably not going to have everything they want, right? Good point.
Wouldn't think so.
Yeah. Anyone else? So let's do the spy narrative, which is a glorious story in Numbers 13 through 14. I'm not going to read the entirety of both chapters, but I'm going to cover some key sections. So the people approach the promised land, and then we get to Numbers 13, and I'll read verses 1 through 3 and then 17 through 24. One second. We're looking up. So the Lord said to Moses, "Send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelites. From each of their ancestral tribes, you shall send a man, every one a leader among them." So Moses sent them from the wilderness of Paran, according to the command of the Lord, all of them leading men among the Israelites. And then we'll go ahead and skip down to verse 17. Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan, and he said to them, "Go up there into the Negev and up into the hill country and see what the land is like, whether the people who live in it are strong or weak, whether they're few or many, and whether the land they live in is good or bad, whether the towns they live in are unwalled or fortified, and whether the land is rich or poor, and whether there are trees in it or not. Be bold and bring back some of the fruit of the land." Now, it was the season of the first ripe grapes. And so they went up and spied out the land from the wilderness of Zin to Rehob near Lebo Hamath. They went up into the Negev, and they came to Hebron, and Ahiman, Sheshai, Talmai, and the Anakites were there. Hebron was built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt. And they came to the Wadi Eshal and cut down from there a branch of a single cluster of grapes and carried it on a pole between the two of them. One cluster needed a whole pole to carry. They also brought some pomegranates and figs. The place was called the Wadi Eshal because of the cluster the Israelites cut down from there. And at the end of the 40 days, they returned from the spying out the land, and they came to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of the Israelites in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They brought them back word and to them and all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land, and they told them, "We came to the land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. Yet the people who live in the land are strong, and their towns are fortified, and they're very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there, and the Amalekites live in the land of the Negev, and the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live by the sea along the Jordan." But Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, "Let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it." Then the men who had gone up with him said, "We're not able to go up against this people. They're stronger than us." So they brought to the Israelites an unfavorable report of the land that they had spied out, saying, "The land that we've gone through as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants. And the people we saw in it are of great size. There we saw the Nephilim, the Anakites come from the Nephilim, and to ourselves we seem like grasshoppers, and so we seem to them. So the spies, it's kind of a mixed report here, right? That we see going on here. You get Caleb, who's like, we can do this. This is fine. God has given us this land. But the spies, they see the people of the land and they are very afraid. The Anakites are some apparently kind of gigantuan people. Later we'll know in the story of David and Goliath that David was a descendant of the Anakites. You also we're told that they're the sons of the Nephilim. If you remember way back in Genesis, the Nephilim were the sons of God who mated with the daughters of men and created the Nephilim. And who the hell knows what that means? We just have no idea. It's just bonkers. So, like, we're scared. There's no faith in the people at this moment. And so they rebel, as we'll see in chapter 14. Then all the congregation raised a loud cry, and the people wept that night. And all the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron, and the whole congregation said to them, "Would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we died in the wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword, our wives and our little ones to become booty? Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt?" Still wanting to go back to Egypt. So they said to one another, "Let us choose a captain and go back to Egypt." Then Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before all the assembly of the congregation of the Israelites, and Joshua, son of Nun, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh, were among those who spied out the land. They tore their clothes and said to the congregation of the Israelites, "The land that we went through as spies is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land that flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord. Do not fear the people of the land, for they are no more than bread for us. Their protection is removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them." But the whole congregation threatened to stone them being Joshua and Caleb. The glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting to all the Israelites, and the Lord said to Moses, "How long will this people despise me? How long will they refuse to believe in me in spite of all the signs I've done among them? I will strike them with pestilence and disinherit them, and I will make of you a greater nation, mightier than they." So this whole idea that, like, the people of Israel have no faith, and God's like, screw it, burn them to the ground. Moses, you're in charge. That didn't just happen once. That's a recurring theme, and we see that as well happening here in chapter 14. And Moses, just like he does earlier, he responds, he intercedes for the people. Beginning in verse 13, "But Moses said to the Lord, then the Egyptians will hear of it, for in your might you brought up this people from among them, and they will tell the inhabitants of the land, they have heard that you, O Lord, are in the midst of the people, for you, O Lord, are seen face to face, and your cloud stands over them, and you go in front of them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Now, if you kill this people all at one time, then the nations will have heard about what you will say. It is because the Lord was not able to bring this people into the land that he swore to give them, that he slaughtered them in the wilderness. And now, therefore, let the power of the Lord be great in the way that you promised when you spoke, saying, the Lord is slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquity and transgression, and by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the parents upon the children to the third and fourth generation. Forgive the iniquity of this people according to the greatness of your steadfast love, just as you have pardoned this people from Egypt even until now. And then the Lord said, I do forgive, just as you've asked. Nevertheless, as I live and as the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord, none of the people who have seen my glory and the signs I did in Egypt and in the wilderness and yet have tested me these 10 times, and have not obeyed my voice, shall see the land that I swore to give to their ancestors. None of them who despised me shall see it. Pushed it a little bit farther there than what I intended, but Moses intercedes, and then there's forgiveness and consequences. God responds to Moses. He forgives the people, but he also says they will not enter the land at all. And then continuing in verse 24, but my servant Caleb, because he has a different spirit and has followed me wholeheartedly, I will bring him to the land into which he went, and his descendants shall possess it. Now, since the Amalekites and the Canaanites live in the valleys, and therefore turn tomorrow, set out toward the wilderness by the way of the Red Sea. So, spying out of the land, the majority of the spies freak out. Small minority, Joshua and Caleb say we can do it. People rebel. God says, screw it. Burn them to the ground. Moses says, no, wait, no, don't. That's not who you are. God forgives the people, does not destroy them, but also says none of them will enter the land. This spy narrative is one of the most important narratives in the book of Numbers. Just questions before we move on? Thoughts? And then after this, I won't read these verses, but in verses 26 through 45, they actually do have an invasion that happens, but it's a faithless invasion, and so it immediately fails. The Amalekites, the Canaanites, just come down and defeat the people of Israel, because they don't go into the invasion at this point with faith, as they could have earlier on. They go into it from this position of a lack of faith. So what are we seeing in all of this? This narrative is the culmination of the faithless grumbling we'd seen earlier. You've heard probably in church some of these grumbling narratives from the text of the Bible before. This is the epitome of, you're on the edge of the promised land. You can see it, and even still they grumble and don't believe in God. The census list from Numbers 1 is the backbone of the spy narrative. They did the census list so they know what kind of force they have, and then from that list, they pick one person to go in from each tribe to serve as a spy. The key point in all of this, though, is that they are rejecting their ancestral Abrahamic promise. God had told Abraham, I will give you this land, and their refusal to enter and take it is a refusal to trust the promise that God had given to Abraham. Despite that failure, though, God continues to forgive. It is God's grace that will eventually enable the promise to be fulfilled when that moment comes. But forgiveness in this text does not cancel out consequences and justice. The people refuse to enter, refuse to believe, and so there must still be consequences to that refusal and to that lack of faith. Questions? Thoughts?
Yeah, I have a question.
Please.
I guess so I'm trying to put Exodus, well, even Genesis, and then the story of Abraham, but Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy together. And it's just a big jumble for me. So how do those three books fit together?
Sure. So Genesis is the story of creation and of the patriarchs leading up to the movement of Joseph into Egypt, which explains why Exodus needs to happen. Exodus, go ahead.
But so in Numbers, there's this big story about pulling an army together to be able to get the land back that Abraham must have somehow. How did Abraham get the land to begin with? There wasn't any story about armies there, was there?
Abraham never had the land. My father was a wandering Aramean. Abraham only ever lived as an undocumented immigrant in the Holy Land. Totally true. He never had the land. It was a promise that Abraham, I'm telling you, you're living as a stranger in this land, but your descendants will have this land. So they're just a small family clan living in the land. And then when the famine happens, the whole group of them, head down to Egypt to survive. Yeah. Okay. That's a big point, Nancy, because a lot of times people assume that Abraham kind of had the land. Abraham, this is the point of the author of the epistle to the Hebrews. Abraham never saw what was promised to him. Never once saw it. Good questions.
Okay.
you have others?
So then Numbers, Deuteronomy, Exodus. How?
Yeah, so if Genesis is kind of the patriarchs and the explanation for why we wound up in Egypt, Exodus is the Exodus. It's the liberation from Egypt and also the creation of the covenant. So you get the covenant code in Exodus. So the first law with the people says Genesis, Exodus. Leviticus is the priestly code where that ritual understanding of the law is shifted significantly, as we see in the book of Leviticus. But once again, is still trying to navigate the relationship between God and his people. Numbers then is the entrance into the land. And then Deuteronomy is this very interesting reinterpretation of the code and of Leviticus and of really everything that's come before, given the experience of exile. So it's kind of Deuteronomy is the rewrite, of the whole shebang. Other questions, comments?
So
Go ahead.
So looking at this text in today's world, is it coming from Genesis that the Jews see the creation of Israel as a fulfillment of the promise, or is it coming from Numbers? Or both?
Both probably, but primarily from Genesis. It's that God promised this to Abraham, and this promise will be made true. So what you see in modern Zionistic Jewish politics is an idea that this land is our land. God is giving this to us even now.
Thank you.
You're welcome. But as well, there is, I would say, an unsettling reading of conquest narrative into modern times, which played a significant role in the formation of the state of Israel and in modern Israeli politics. And that's above my pay grade to explain. But as a reality, I think we need to wrestle with as Christians. And I'll deal with some of that more in next week's class when we deal with the conquest itself. This week is much more kind of leading up to the conquest. But I personally, I find the conquest narrative to be one of the most troubling texts in the Hebrew Bible. And as well, one of the most pertinent, precisely because of questions as it relates to peace in the Holy Land between Israel and the Palestinians. Great. So what we'll see in all of this is that we'll see God save the little ones in the face of giants. That's kind of what's being foreshadowed in the spy narrative, that God is always on the side of the little people in the face of giants in Scripture, and we see that will take place in this narrative as well. Any other comments, questions, conversation before we wrap up for the night? And like I said, next week we'll move more into the conquest itself, but anything else that you're kind of wondering about?
I just have a comment about
Please.
My Sunday school understanding of Moses kind of probably ended with the fact that he received the 10 Commandments. And I didn't realize that his story carries forward, through so much of the Scripture. I find that very interesting.
Yeah, and I think this is why I find these, kind of Old Testament survey classes helpful, because a lot of us have that kind of Sunday school understanding of these characters. And when you get the broad sweep of things, it's kind of like I talked about in a sermon a couple of weeks ago. When at the end, Moses just got pissed off and hit the rock with a stick and said he was going to fix everything. And then God said he couldn't. Like, I kind of get why Moses was angry. Like, he'd had a crap job. He was already retired. He was like in his 60s when all of this started, when he got the burning bush, right? And that now at the end of all of this, the people still don't trust him. They still don't believe him. I mean, there's an empathy, I feel like, for that frustration. And at the same time, there's an understanding for why God is angry with Moses. that every single time Moses has needed God, God has showed up. Every single time. So yeah, the people grumble again. Why is Moses freaking out? Is this his first time? It'd be like being a priest. You'd be like, the people are angry at me. It's like, well, this happened to me. When I was a priest, I remember I had this major, there was a big fight at St. John's, and I got very angry on the phone with someone, and I called a mentor of mine, and I was like, Bob, I'm a failure. I got so angry. This is I just poured my heart out. I'm sure I'm the only person who's experienced this, because we all think our pain is like our own pain, right? And I finished and Father Bob was like, well, Jared, sounds like you're the rector of a Episcopal mid-sized parish in the U.S. Buckle up. This is what it looks like. Right, but just that willingness to be honest with me, that like, hey, yeah, people are going to get angry with you. That's not the end of the world. That's just ministry. That's just what it looks like. But to be the person who would say that to me. And so I feel like with Moses, to me, this is why I've said, as I said, previous class, I really would love to write a book or find a good book on Moses. His story is so much bigger than the thumbnail you get in the 10 Commandments or Prince of Egypt. It really is. Yeah, it is. So I'm right with you, Catherine. I think that a lot of us just, don't know all of the whole breadth of Moses' and to me, it means like when we get to the Transfiguration, where Moses shows up on the mount with Jesus and is talking to him, I think Moses has pretty good advice. Because it's not just the Sunday school Moses, right? But the Moses that you've actually seen in Hebrew scripture, like they're gonna hate you no matter what. Just so you know, Jesus, like Moses knows some things. So I think getting the broad sweep of this helps with those texts for us as Christians. Other comments, questions, thoughts? All right, so I'll send out an email with the specific readings, but next week we'll do the second part of Numbers. And I think I might have time to do a little of Deuteronomy before we do our Advent book reading. But I will say, if you didn't already see, that we are going to do an Advent book group. We're going to be reading Fleming Rutledge's book on Advent. It's a big book, so over 300 pages. We are not going to be discussing the whole book. I want to be clear, should read the whole book. It is glorious. Fleming Rutledge is one of the first people ordained to the priesthood, first women ordained to the priesthood in the Episcopal Church, and remains, she was ordained in the 70s, remains one of the most important voices in the Episcopal Church today, I would say. So definitely get the book. I'd really encourage you to read more than what I'm recommending. I think it'll really add to your Advent. So, all right, that's all for tonight. I'm going to turn the recording off. There it is. Stop share. Turn recording off.